Boy, that tune just puts a smile on my face every time I hear it. If you're like me, you love what it means because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Reed, Rec Poker Jim on Twitter, and Bluffsterini in the home games. I'm your host tonight of the Rec Poker Podcast. Rec Poker is a fantastic group of serious, thoughtful, fun, amateur players. We're recreational players, but we study hard, we study together. We learn together, we play together, we celebrate together, we commiserate together, we make each other better, and we do it through this fantastic group at Rec Poker. So come get a free account today. Head on over to www.rec.poker and sign up for a free community account, or go premium. If you use the code RECPOKER, your first month of premium membership is only $5. And our premium membership is really important to what we do here. It unlocks all sorts of training opportunities, study groups, strategy discussions, live one-on-one action with our wrecking crew, social events, discounts on other members' sites and other training sites throughout the world. And it's just a great way to share your support for what we do here at Rec Poker. So do come give our premium membership a try. You get to hear my voice a lot because they hand me the mic on Mondays, but it's not just me. I am one of the wrecking crew members that make all the magic happen here, along with our amazing sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. If you want to find out more about me and the rest of the members of the wrecking crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew, or just listen up because you'll meet a few of them right here tonight on the show.
Well, I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the PokerStars home game.
And I'm John Somsky. I'm Poker Geek MN everywhere.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I'm PetVet33 in the home game, PetVet_33 on Twitter.
I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman50 just about everywhere.
So I've got the best job in the world. I get to hang out here with my poker friends and talk about this game that we love so much. This week, now in the forums edition of the podcast, we usually take a specific hand or a post from the Rec Poker forums and talk about it here on the air. Tonight, because it's the first forums edition that's coming out in the month of April, we're going to be talking about the theme of the month. So every month at Rec Poker, our premium membership studies and sort of coalesces around a theme each month. And Chris Jones does a fantastic job building these out in advance. We have a number of different learning opportunities and playing sessions and strategy conversations based around this theme each month. And we kind of tie a bow on it at the end with a Q&A with Chris himself. And most of what we do in the month at Rec Poker, not everything, but most of it's based around the theme. So we've started kind of having the podcast do a bit of a primer each month to talk about the theme of the month. And that's what we're going to do today. So without further ado, Chris Jones, we've been looking at, in previous months, flop c-bet sizing, flop c-bet ranges, and now we're taking it to the next street, the turn, and what kind of factors might influence our play on the turn. So Chris, please take it away and tell our amazing listeners some of the knowledge nuggets that you've uncorked in your time working this together.
Well, it's not just me, but the whole team, we're really just kind of plugging along with this. But this has kind of been a 4-month journey. We're about halfway through now. We've kind of plugged away. We looked at why we might want to take some different sizes to our c-bets. We looked, and that was in February. In March, we looked at why we might want to take some different approaches across our range in terms of c-betting. What would we check? What would, if this is a street where we might, or it is a flop where we might bet big, what part of our range bets big and what part maybe doesn't? And so that's kind of where we've been going along already. And now we've arrived at the turn. And part of this is like thinking about, okay, I took your crazy advice. I did an overbet on the flop because this seemed like one, and we talked about it. But they called me. They were supposed to fold. Now I've reached a turn. What the heck do I do after I've made this bet where it's not a situation that I'm in all that often? And so what we want to talk about this month is a little bit about turns and like, what is our approach? Particularly, we're looking at turns from the perspective of where we have had the sort of initiative or whatever you want to call it, where we bet the pre-flop, arrived at a flop, we see bet, and now we're here. And I think there's always this question of, do I want to check back and sort of pot control? Do I want to double barrel? When do I want to double barrel? Why do I want to double barrel? What changes, what factors do I want to look at when I'm sort of making that kind of decision? And that's really where we're going to be spending the month, kind of, and to sort of prime this conversation. I just recommend that everybody go out there and read this article. So Andrew Brokus is, Thinking Poker podcast, written some great books on GTO. He's also now writing some columns for GTO Wizard. GTO Wizard, an expensive program, but they have a free blog and it's got some amazing free content on it. And right now, pretty recently, he wrote an article as I was kind of like thinking about all this stuff and putting it together. He wrote an article called Principles of Turn Strategy. And I want to borrow kind of a quote from that to get us started. And this is what he writes. As the pot gets larger and betting opportunities fewer, right? Because on a turn, the pot has grown, but we have fewer opportunities to place a bet. Players are more compelled to play according to the incentives of their hand class. And for me, that starts to get at this kind of like, I think, conventional wisdom or, thing that we've all heard, is that the turn is the street of honesty. And part of that, I think, is this idea that we are really incentivized to play the kind of holding we have in a slightly more straightforward way. It doesn't mean, though, that when we check, we have nothing, or when we bet, we always have something. That's not what that street of honesty quite means. What it tends to mean is that this is the street where we start to polarize a little. So we're going to bet some of our best and some of our worst hands that have some equity or draws. Those are going to be the kinds that we're going to maybe double barrel. And the kinds that we're going to maybe check back or kind of try to get to a river are going to be those sort of middling strength hands, those mid-strength hands that don't really want to see a lot more pressure put on them, that maybe, if you listen to our previous episode, they maybe aren't a 3-street hand. And that's part of where we want to start to analyze our turn play. So with that, I would open it up for other kind of conversation and sort of thoughts about some of those topics.
Well, I just think this is the perfect follow-up episode to last week, where we were talking about assessing the strength of our hand and trying to decide how many streets of value can we get. A lot of that's dependent on the run-up and sort of, are there good cards, good turns for us and bad turns for us. And so I'm excited to kind of see how we explore that here. Right.
It's interesting. I've noticed I don't know if it's a trend, but I've noticed this betting line happening quite a bit, where you continuation bet the flop and then you check back the turn, and then the big blind bets out on the river, and you're sitting there with your ace high saying, what am I beating here? Whereas if you bet the flop and then bet the turn, now you have shown a very strong range. And in that case, then the big blind is very not apt to bet out on the river against you. So it's kind of it's a weird dynamic that I've been seeing play out quite a bit in the games I play. So I was just wondering, how does that affect, when you're up against that type of big blind player, how does that affect your turn strategy?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really good question, because I think we do want to sometimes check back, but there are going to be players who are always going to take advantage of people who do that check back. But I think what that means to me is that we're still probably in that situation, if we don't bet our ace high, that may be a hand that we have to fold, but we're going to have to bluff catch more with those kind of like, if we're up against this, we're going to have to bluff catch with some of those second pairs and some of those kinds of ones that we were like, you know, and like, but it's still, I think, a better approach there than barreling and, you know, getting ourselves into a lot of trouble. We actually, one of the things I will say about that was fun this month, we had for the first time ever, we had 2 playing sessions. We had our typical fourth Monday evening session, but we also had what I am referring to as the Aussie home game.
Oh, right.
Troy Chapman organized a game amongst a bunch of Aussie players so they could kind of get involved, and he recorded all the hands. And there was a really great hand that is going to be in the seminar that I think is a prime example of getting ourselves into trouble when we barrel the turn with a kind of a marginal strength hand. And it's like the perfect example hand. And I'm excited for people to see it.
So Chris, what are some, or sorry, Rob, go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention another way of betting the turn that we don't really talk about much as the delayed continuation bet. Because a lot of times what we've been talking about here is, okay, we bet on the flop, they called, now we're on the turn. But in the normal flow, they're going to check to us. And if we check back, and then they check again, now we bet the turn. So there's that other turn bet that's really what it is a delayed continuation bet. So that's something that we should also discuss when we discuss turn betting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're going to notice from last week's conversation and from this whole month's theme is that the actions that our opponents take on previous streets becomes very relevant because how they define their own range through checking or betting or calling is, you know, the further you get in the hand on the turn, you should have significantly more information about your opponent's range than you do on the flop. And just like on the river, again, you should have even more information about your opponent's range because they've had to go through these decision points. So the later you get in the hand, the less the 2 cards that you're holding, in one way, the less it kind of matters. But interestingly, in another way, the more free you are to actually play based on their hand strength as well. So yeah, so it's a very, and the turn is kind of unique in this way because it has this elements of the flop and elements of the river. I think, Chris, I like that quote from Andrew Brokers really well, where the opportunities to bet have diminished and the size of the pot has increased. That really strikes at kind of the dynamic that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, and one of the things that he talks about, what the, you know, that necessarily means too, is that draws are really complicated on the turn. They're on one hand, and this is not an original thought of mine, so I'm not trying to take credit for this, but on one hand, they're highly incentivized to bet because they usually are quite weak against what we assume any kind of value most draws can't be ahead of. You know, some draws can, but most draws are not ahead of any kind of value. And at the same time, they're also there's this kind of push-pull because they're also incentivized to check sometimes because they only have one more card to come. It's not like the flop where they might have had a really nice draw and now they have 2 cards to come. This is a spot where there's only one more card to come. The draws are going to be much less likely to hit. And what do we do with that?
I was going to say there's also the whole box of what you do on the turn after raise the flop. So after you've check raised the flop, come out of position, and now you're facing a turn. Now what do you do? So So, I mean, there's so much with the turn, like, so,
Yeah, I like that. I also think of the turn as being sort of the last chance to get value from draws on the other side of the draw equation, because once the river comes, there's no ocean. People aren't calling with draws on the river. So if you are going to get value from draws, the flop and the turn are your only opportunities to do so. So how you play your own draws and how you play sort of to capture value from your opponent's draws is a very turn centric decision there as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much the same thing. I think if you listen to past episodes when we've talked about hands and decision trees and what's going on, a lot of times when you get to that turn, and then we talked about streets of value. If you're going to get 2 streets of value with a hand, usually that's going to be the turn or the flop and the turn, because on the river, the hand is either there or not, and they're either going to call or not. So, especially with apparent draws on the board, it's very important to get that value bet in on the turn while they still have hope.
Mm, I like that. And I guess the only other thing that in the abstract that occurs to me when we talk about turn decisions is baseline sizing. So we're going to be deviating from sizing. You know, we don't want to always be in a cookie cutter sizing box, but for the games that we're playing, a lot of the times on most boards, having a relatively small flop bet and following that up with a relatively large turn bet is a profitable action, because our opponents kind of cap their range by calling the small flop bet, and they continue with a range to the turn that has a lot of hands left in it that have to fold to a larger sizing. So of course you want to do that with a balanced range, and you want to have value hands in there as well as bluff hands. And the savvier you get, the more studied a poker player you get, the more you will deviate from that based on certain runouts and board textures. But in the cookie cutter world, that small flop bet, large turn bet is a pretty good way to make some money in this game that we know. Kim?
no, just sometimes our C bets are delayed till the turn, right? So sometimes our turn bet is a delayed continuation bet. And sometimes we'll have turn bets that are just probes from the big blind. Like when we're called by the big blind and we might have gone check, check, and now the bet on the turn is the big blind probing. So it's there's so much to turn betting. There's so much
It's
to
true.
poker, I can't take it.
And that's actually one great point. Ryan LaPlante talks about this quite a bit, is that when it goes check, check on the flop, leading the turn as the out of position player is an underdeveloped branch of the decision tree for a lot of recreational poker players. That's something that we kind of get stuck playing in flow, and we just by default check that turn again to the pre-flop aggressor. But I'd challenge our listeners to think about ways to play a little less conventionally, and to think about what parts of their range might benefit from that turn lead, but also what parts of their opponent's range have checked behind the flop, and what that means for the strength of their hand.
One thing I'd add, because I've just been, if you've been following along with these past few months, we've gone through these flop textures that are related to some of the approaches, why we might want to have some flop textures where we take some big bets, why we might. But one of the other things, when you look at how a solver approaches a turn, right? Particularly we're talking about from the out of position player's perspective. And if you're just starting to think about okay, we've had a C bet and a call, and now we've reached a turn. And if that's something where you're rarely leading out, one of the most common approaches that a solver takes in terms of leading out in this situation is let's say we have a flop that's ace 8-3, and we've called this from the big blind. If the 8 or the 3 pairs, that is a really common spot where we, as the big blind player, whether we have an 8 or a 3 or not, we can take the lead in the hand. Because we just have so many more of those hands. If we had a small bet on the flop, they're going to call with all of their 8x and their 3x. And so now we've reached this turn, and that is a spot where at least solvers really, and it puts the player, even if they have an ace, kind of back on their heels a lot. So it's a spot where if you're trying to figure out spots to do this, and really think about the kinds of turns that have changed the nature of what is the best hand to a dramatic degree. So if our opponent had a lot of the ace X, especially the good ace X, in their range, they c-bet, and now a card comes that has radically changed that ace X now feels a lot less comfortable. That's a really good spot for us to probe bet as the big blind.
So Chris, what are some other, I mean, we've talked about a lot of them here. Maybe we've wrapped them all up. Are there some sort of other general rules, or some, not cookie cutter, but like high frequency situations that we might encounter that we can kind of have a little laminated tip card in our back pocket?
I mean, I think one of the other things that I think particularly that came up a lot in some of the play that I was watching from both tables, I think a lot of players struggle, and we all struggle, right? Because like multi-way pots are really hard, but I think players particularly struggle multi-way on turns. Like the turn, I think people tend to think of like, okay, I have top pair. We're in a 3-way pot. I bet small with my top pair on the flop, and I get called by 2 players. And then there's a brick on the turn, right? So I had, let's say I had ace 10 or something. I don't know. I'm making this up. I had ace 10, and I opened early position. I got called by the cutoff and the big blind, and it came 10, 8, 7, and I lead small, and I get called in 2 places, and the turn is a deuce. I think a lot of players will take that bricky spot there, and in a heads up spot, I think that would be a very reasonable spot to bet. But when the big blind checks to us, we still have a player in position to act behind us. And the big blind, by the way, can still have a lot of good hands because they've called that spot there. And we have to be tremendously careful in these kinds of spots. And we can do a lot more check calling from that on that turn in that kind of scenario, in that kind of formation, than leading out like to one of our traditional big turn bets. You can get in just a mountain of trouble with a hand that you really don't want to fold, but you're very rarely ahead.
So the last thing that I want to bring to the table here is a lot of our Wrecking Crew members offer coaching through our membership program. If you go to the Rec Poker shop, you can see different ways to coach with different members of the Wrecking Crew. The way that I do a lot of my coaching is through data analysis, taking people's Poker Tracker 4 database and looking at them and comparing their whole game together. And we heard Chris earlier mention like the street of honesty. And the turn for a lot of players is the street of honesty. And it's a street where if you're looking at their flop, turn, and river frequencies for either betting or calling or raising, the turn stands out. And I want to talk just a little bit about playing against other, exploiting other players on the turn, because like Chris is saying, and if you're listening, you're probably getting the sense that like, it's kind of an uncomfortable street. It's kind of like the flop. It's kind of like the river. The pot's big. We're only one more card to come. I think it might be The river is the river is the street that gets misplayed the most expensively, but I think the turn might be the street that gets misplayed the most often. And by players who just don't, they kind of like do what feels comfortable or natural to them. And you can tell a lot based on if you have a lot of hands on a player and you can kind of examine their frequencies like we do in our coaching groups, then you can get a sense of, oh, well, this player c-bets 70% on the flop, 30% on the turn, and then, 80% on the river again. Well, let me tell you, you can call that flop bet. And when they don't bet the turn, that they don't have something and you can take it away on the river. You can float that flop very profitably. Other players, they never fold to a flop c-bet, but then when you double barrel, they fold way too frequently to the turn c-bets. And, you'd be crazy if you were trying to play in a balanced GTO fashion against these players, because you should just be bluffing the heck out of them on the turn when you don't have it, and saving that value bet for the river when you're not going to scare them off when you do. So and again, I want to repeat what Chris said. This isn't original thought for me. I think Sky Matsuhashi talks a lot about the turn specifically being like this street of honesty, and that's probably where I picked it up. But it's something that, part of it is going to be you understanding your own turn frequencies and what makes you uncomfortable and kind of playing defense. And then part of it is going to be understanding what makes other people feel uncomfortable about the turn and playing offense and exploiting their mistakes as well. Rod?
I was just gonna mention what Chris talked about, the opportunity of the big blind to come out on the turn when one of those little cards hit that pairs the board. The opposite effect can be true, because as a c-better on the flop, a lot of times you're betting with less than a stellar hand. Let's face it. We don't hit any more than the big blind hits, right? So
Speak for yourself. I only have it when I see that.
So another opportunity as the pre-flop aggressor and the c-better on the flop is when one of those big cards hits. One of those cards like an ace or king that still didn't help you, but probably didn't help the big blind and probably hurt him more than it did you. So it gives you the opportunity to put that bet out on the turn when you see that kind of card, rather than get into that situation where you end up checking and then he leads out on the river and you're going, yeah, I don't know where I'm at anymore. I'm done. So it does give you another opportunity to try to win the hand on that c-bet. And I like what you said about looking at stats. A couple of the stats that I have on my HUD are the percentage of people c-betting the flop, c-betting the turn, and the percentage of people folding to a c-bet on the flop and folding to a c-bet on the turn. And if you got somebody that is never folding on the turn, he's very tough to play against. But if you got somebody that's folding he's folding 80% of the time on the turn, well, you can pretty much just flagrantly bet the turn no matter what you have, because he's floating a lot of flops to be able to fold that many turns.
Yep, very true. I guess the last thing that occurs to me is something that makes the turn interesting is that it's where backdoors go to die. So there's a lot of the time when because we see bet flops at a high frequency. When we're in a position to continuation bet the flop, usually we do it at a high frequency. I don't want to overgeneralize, but on a lot of boards, we're c-betting at a high frequency. Some of those hands that we're doing it with are hands that have backdoor draws on the flop. And when certain turn cards land, they continue our hope for making that draw, whether it's a flush draw or a straight draw. And we can kind of continue this this show of strength as if we have a really strong hand when that backdoor on the turn comes in, it gives us that sort of permission to continue betting. But of course, a lot of the times the wrong card comes on the turn. We don't get to continue with our backdoors. And so savvy players can kind of analyze, just say, okay, well, was this a card that was good for some of those backdoors, or was this a card that was bad for some of those backdoors? And when our opponent does choose to continue, are they a player that's even operating on that level? Is that something that we should be factoring in? But I know I've been in that position where I've got a lot of things going for me on the flop, and sometimes it's just not a good turn card. Like, negative events happen. It's just a bad event that you get the wrong card on the turn and you can't continue. And our opponents, if they're paying attention, be the opponent that's paying attention, because it gives you an opportunity to kind of take one away from some of those more aggressive players when the wrong card comes on the turn, and it's where one of those back doors went to die. What else should we talk about turns, gang? Is there anything else? Don't tell me, Chris. I'm having a vision for the theme in May. Is it rivers?
Does happen to be that.
Oh my God.
We're on this little 4-month post-flop journey. And we're not really exploring everything there is to know about rivers and turns, because there's just mountains of information. So we really are looking at it specifically from the kind of in position player that came out and had the initiative and c-bet, and now they've found themselves on a turn. But obviously there's a million things you can talk about these things, and there's all kinds of other things. And same for the rivers. We're going to kind of look at that from that perspective. And we'll see where this gets us, and then we're going to start exploring some other things. But yeah, rivers are up next.
Nice. And if you're a premium member and you're listening to this, listen, it's well worth your time to sign up for Chris's deep dive play along seminar. It's on the 4th Monday of every month. We do it right after the Chats edition of the podcast. You're going to end up playing with some other premium members in a simulated tournament environment. We're going to try and tweak the settings a bit, maybe plant a couple of players in there to elicit the kind of hands that we're trying to examine in the theme of the
I got to get everyone really deep next month, because I want them to play.
You got to get to rivers, right? No, it's true. Exactly. Because it's not, meaningful river decisions don't happen off 15 or 20 big blind stacks. So that's a great point. But what Chris does is he captures this play between our members with cards up. He does his own analysis. He gets Dara O'Kearney involved. Dara runs these hands through his own solver, provides his own analysis. Chris kind of sums it all up in this video that kind of tackles some of the theory and some of the application. And if you're a premium member that takes part in this activity, you can get some real feedback on how you could play poker better from Chris Jones and Dara O'Kearney. So it's really high value. It's really fun. Our members love it. And it's free for all our premium members.
And then I'll just say also, we're going to shift now our end of the month. So we've done this beginning of the month comes out with a video, the end of the month. What had been traditionally kind of the Q&A, rather than doing that, we're going to actually just sit down together and watch the playing session. So we'll talk through it. We'll look at the hands. We'll kind of go over the spots together and look at kind of those spots. And I mean, I think that'll be a really good way to kind of run through those spots, so that we get even more use out of that playing session.
Mm-hmm. So if you want to get some personalized, tailored feedback on your own game, the deep dive that Chris does every month, it's a great way to do it. It's multifaceted. You can hear from a lot of different people. We can shine a light on your game and see how you can improve. John, did you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, so we've had, does this make 4 sessions now straight for post-flop that there will have been? So the post-flop poker podcast had 124 episodes before they called it quits. So we might not necessarily glean all of the information that there is to glean out of post-flop.
I think that's likely true.
That's so funny. Oh man, I was actually talking to Merv Harvey today, We were talking because Merv's getting more involved with Rec Poker over the last little while. I think since the Post Flop Poker podcast finally ended, he's jonesing for another fun, recreationally minded poker podcast. So you might see Merv Harvey getting a little more involved in Rec Poker right here, and that's a great point, John. We're not going to solve all the turn problems in one theme of the month, but look out. We are.
I don't know
back
if
in
you
the
ever
field.
listened to the Post Flop Poker podcast, but that's not all they talked about.
No, that's true. That's true. That's true. That is a good one. And listen, it's still out there. If you're listening to this, if you enjoy the show, go back and you can search on your podcast for the Post Flop Poker podcast with Merv and Ben and Mike and a couple other characters over the years. And just tell them that Jim and the Rec Poker Gang sent you. But otherwise, I just want to thank Rob Washam, Kim Kilroy, John Somsky, and Chris Jones for their contributions to the theme of the month and for this excellent conversation that we had about turn play, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. Of course, everyone at Rec Poker who posts in the forums, and you, the listeners, we wouldn't do it without you. So thanks for tuning in. See you next week.